Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another, we're going to call this the Coach's Corner with Trenton and Dean. That's what we're calling this. Dean's got his truck in the back. Me and Trenton look like we're just studious people hanging out here with our bookshelves. Dean made it very clear that bookshelves are not as cool as his truck. We get it. But we're not here to talk about bookshelves or trucks today. We have some really cool stuff that both Dean and Trent have been a part of that we want to share with you. Some of you may have heard at this point about this State of Student Success and Engagement for Higher Education report that we did. Let me give just a quick background, and then I'm going to turn it over to Trent and Dean to talk, and I'm going to jump in as I do with different questions and comments throughout. This is a piece of research that we did with a group called Hanover Research. You may be familiar with them. Looked at over 7,000 students, administrators, and faculty, 13 countries. What was the impact of COVID-19 on education from a higher ed standpoint? And some of the data is super interesting. You won't be surprised by a lot of it. You look at some of the socioeconomic things that have happened, some of the things that have come out around what are students really caring the most about right now related to engagement. But we're going to dig into all of that. But before we do, Trenton and Dean, let's get your initial thoughts just on the overall report. What are you seeing and thinking about related to student success and engagement right now?
T, do you want to tee it up? And
Go ahead, Dean. Go ahead. Yeah, you go ahead.
You know, for me, I'm sitting here going, I get it. I get where this report is coming from. And for me, engagement and equity, those are two of the most critical things that we need to be thinking about in terms of how are we best connecting with students and how are we making learning personal. As I go through this and I look at what it is telling me in terms of anecdotal evidence, it's that students are more focused on the end goal, which is career readiness or college readiness. Our instructors need to be thinking differently in terms of what does engagement mean and how do we redefine engagement in a virtual world. For me, those are the two things that jump out the most and are the highest leverage levers to pull in terms of ensuring student success moving forward. I think there's a lot of correlates between K-12 and 12 through 16 on this. And I'll let Trenton share some of his insight as well. So,
yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. And when we talk about equity, I'm still hung up on that equity issue as we go through this, because there are places where it's not a surprise to find that we don't have the equity that in terms of access to the internet, access to devices, that obviously our lowest income students are feeling it more than most of our students. But even when we see numbers like 88, 89% of our students have access to these things, that sounds great. That sounds like a big number, but that's also a huge number of students who are having their access denied. And so I see it. I see that we have work to do. And one of the things as I look through this report that I worry that people will celebrate too much is like, boy, that feels like we're where we want to be. And we're not where we want to be until every student is there. And then the other way I look at this report is, this is interesting for me as a K-12 educator who spent too much time in higher ed. I also look at it from the standpoint of a parent who has two children that are currently in college. One is just finishing up their undergrad, and my daughter is in her second year as an undergrad. And I'm thinking about the equity issues, and I'm looking at my own kids and thinking I'm grateful for the kinds of opportunities that they have had, that they, as their university went to a remote learning environment, they weren't really that impacted in terms of their access, but I also got to see how different they responded to that experience. My son it was great for him. He was like, "It's fantastic. You know, I don't even have to get dressed to go to class." Where my daughter, who tends to be much more sensitive and more studious in a lot of ways, it created a lot of anxiety for her. That it, like you said, the engagement and the interaction, that inability to connect with her peers, or that inability to connect with her professors, really had an impact on her. She actually opted out this semester. She's like, I need to take this semester off and regroup. And so I know, like, I can see both sides of it. My son, who's like flourishing in this environment, and my daughter, who says, I'm missing out on something. And so I think as you think about what Dean was talking about, how important equity is, how important engagement is, that doesn't change in a virtual environment. Our students are still needing us to be thinking about creative ways that we can remain connected with them and make this feel personal.
I love that. So let's dig into this piece of data really quick. So we asked students, again, remember 7,000 plus educators, students, administrators were surveyed for this report. We asked current students and administrators what contributes to student success. Answers across all regions were, as you can see here, 78%. Dean talked about this earlier. Students are totally focused on work and career readiness. What most of you probably do know or don't know about Dean, Dean is a vice president down with one of the technical institutes here in Utah. Has a close relationship with the commissioner of education and talks with them regularly. And so Dean's got some interesting perspectives because he's been able to bounce some of this data and things off with the commissioner. And we're going to dig into that into a minute. Work career readiness was 78%, student educational goals 76%, holistic development 75%. So anything in here, Trenton and Dean, that makes you pause, or does it all kind of seem like, well, yeah, that totally makes sense to me?
You know, the thing that gives me a moment for pause is kind of going back to the two E's I talked about. You know, we have equity and we have engagement. We also have a really good opportunity to be empathetic as leaders right now. We're all students. I'm Dr. Dean, but I'm learning a whole new way of learning right now. And it's not just for my students, it's also for my staff. It's also for the support staff at our schools. We're all trying to figure out what it means to be successful in this new setting that we find ourselves in. What hasn't changed is students still are accessing education for the purpose of career or personal advancement. They still want to have their educational goals met. And if anything, you know, I look at self-directed learning as being a really powerful lever we can pull in K-12 to move students towards achievement. I look at authentic learning experiences. Do we really go through and teach about not just the theory, but are we teaching the practical application of the theory? And we don't live in an environment where just teaching from the book or teaching from the pulpit is good enough anymore. We have to pivot. We have to adapt, or education, I hate to say it, will die a slow death. I don't think we're at the point of death. I think we're at the point of revitalization, re-envisioning what it is that careers are and what education can be. For me, this is nothing that really surprises me that students want a clear work path. They want their goals met. They want to be developed, not just as a rote learner, but also as an individual. In essence, they want to make learning personal. How are we meeting that need is the question I ask myself. And are we as ed leaders really taking a look in the mirror and seeing what we need to adapt, identifying our personal biases, identifying our preconceived notions of education? Are we willing to challenge that as we've asked our students? Or are we just Pontius Pilate hoping that people are going to follow along and do as we say? I hope that we're doing the prior, but hope isn't a strategy. So what are we doing to actively take steps to move in a more personalized direction? T, what do you got on that?
So, you know, it's interesting. When I saw this, when I saw this information, it was my response was not maybe what a lot of people's response is, because both Dean and I come from blue collar backgrounds. If I'd have known he was going to be in his garage next to his truck, I would have been in my garage. I'm just finishing up a restoration. We're very different. Dean's more of like a V8 American muscle kind of guy. I'm very into European smaller vehicles, and so, but we're both that kind of hands-on. Dean works in a college and career readiness environment where he's preparing students for careers. But I also think when I looked at this, I know a lot of people see that 78% and go, that's where kids' heads are at. I was actually heartened to see those other two in there, that it's not just about kids going to college to get a job, but we're also seeing colleges be that important place where kids are there because they want to advance their education for the sake of growth and development, that there's a holistic approach to this. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in getting kids in and out of college and into a career environment, as opposed to giving kids that opportunity to explore, to have that time in their lives when they are finding themselves. And I know a lot of kids, with the cost of college and everything else, feel a tremendous amount of pressure to get in and to get out. But I think back on my time in college, I had multiple majors. I wasn't really that sure what I wanted to do. I didn't go in thinking that I was going to leave a teacher or a school administrator, but my experiences in college led me there, and I'm grateful for every one of those experiences. And that also included time in college that I went to the technical school near my university for courses because I wanted to work with my hands and learn how to do some of those kinds of things. And so I like that what we're getting out of this is that kids are finding their ways, but they're also feeling that pressure, to get in and have skills that they're going to be able to take with them out into the workforce. So I think the more cognizant we are of the fact that this college is more than just a way to, get a job, but it's also that we have students who are very interested in actually being there to learn and to grow in those formative years. I think that's something that people have to keep in mind.
Interesting. So let me throw you for a little bit of a loop, T and Dean. So it was definitely a top factor, career readiness, but it was also a top challenge that we think is going to increase over the next 12 months. One, why do you think that's the case? And have you seen any changes in those priorities because of COVID?
Well, I'll jump right in here and say I think it's a challenge because I think it's challenging to rethink assessment. I think it's challenging to rethink instruction. And really, it should come in that order. And I know that sounds backwards, but how are we going to authentically assess a student's skill set in a virtual world or in an adaptive world? And more importantly, how do we align that instruction to get that student to the point where they're ready to be assessed? For me at a technical college, it's been amazing to see some of the creative ways that our students that are unable to attend classes have still been able to engage and move forward in their programs. It's been as simple as sometimes taking a video of a weld to ensure that you can demonstrate mastery if you can't come into the welding shop. If students are working on a culinary skill set, maybe they have to cook at home and then present the plate and walk through on a Zoom or walk through on any sort of medium in order to get that feedback prior to passing off a skill set. So for me, I look at this and say, it's hard because we have never had to think this way. We've never had to redesign our assessment or our instruction in a digital world and in a virtual setting. And so those are the things that stick out to me in terms of barriers. But I can tell you this, man, we are smart. Humans are adaptable. We are creative. By nature, we are made to design and create. We have the power to do this. It's a matter of, are we willing to acknowledge that we need to and then take those first steps? That's my takeaways from it. T, what about you?
Yeah, and I think that we also have to account for fear and anxiety that students are feeling right now. And I think there's a lot of fear and anxiety when it comes to like, why are kids maybe feeling a little more concerned or stressed about that college and career readiness piece? I think there's a question that's in the back of people's minds in whatever field they're in. Is what I'm getting right now equal to what I would have gotten prior to the pandemic? Am I actually learning and getting the skill sets that I would have gotten had this not happened? And so I think that maybe it might be a little subconscious, but I think we all feel and question, is the experience that I'm getting in an online or remote environment equal to what I would have gotten? And so for if I'm a student, that does start to make me like worry just a little bit. Am I going to be prepared? Or is there something about this experience that is leaving me a little less prepared than others who have already been down this road and did it in a more traditional way? I'm not saying that is the case, but I think that for a lot of students, in the back of their minds, they're wondering, I'm paying a lot of money for this, and is the experience that I'm getting equal to, and is it preparing me for what I need? It may be in the workforce, but also in those future courses. Am I going to show up later down the road and realize that I wasn't as prepared as I should have been? So
that's interesting to think about, T, because when the three of us think about what work looks like today, we spend a lot of time doing what we're doing right now. I mean, the amount of Zoom calls and strategy sessions that I'm on right now, I just barely got off of one where it's me and a whole bunch of people on a computer screen. I mean, honestly, this might be the best way to prepare them for the future, which I know is a scary thing to think about, but it may be.
Yeah.
Let's jump onto this one.
Take, Mark. I think that may be true.
So let's jump into teaching and learning. You guys have both seen the data. Survey revealed here that students and administrators feel student success is driven by, not surprising, academic factors. So you look at things like 88% quality of faculty, technology availability, engaging content instruction, hands-on instruction, access to the internet, learning resources, and on and on and on from there. As you look at this data, you think as educators, which both of you are, you see that quality of faculty is right up there near the top, just below access to the internet. How are we supporting schools today, or students today better, with all the changes that COVID has brought? Are we doing a good job, or what do we need to do better? Dean.
Well, I'm going to say this: when you're green, you grow. When you're ripe, you rot. And right now, I definitely believe we are in the state of green, or we ought to be. We ought to be green. We ought not be ripe right now. When I look at the quality of faculty, I go back to teacher credibility. That is a huge influencer in K-12 research in terms of students being willing to, one, accept the message, two, internalize the message, and three, actually learn from the message that's being delivered. When I look at the quality of faculty, if a faculty's job is to ensure student learning, my job as an administrator is to ensure faculty learning. So what am I doing to ensure that those faculty members have the necessary skills to adapt and to teach in this multimodal world right now? I think too often we think as educators, and especially as educational leaders, we'll just pivot and move. It should be okay. Well, it may be a technical adaptation. It may be something more in depth. It may be an adaptive change that we need to have. Whether it's technical or adaptive, technical changes are easy. Adaptive changes take time. Are we providing time, space, and quality resources for our educators to ensure student learning? Because if we're not doing that, we're not being good stewards of those faculty members that are within our buildings.
That's interesting. So T, I actually want to pivot a little bit on this because of your perspective with your children. How should faculty and teachers be thinking about teaching and learning from a student's perspective among all these changes?
Yeah, it's interesting that so many, like, this is give or take. Like, how do these lay out? Which are the most important? I mean, they're so evenly matched. And the thing that I think is really important is we're thinking about the students, is that one on the bottom, the psychological well-being of our students. That college is already fraught with stress and anxiety. Our students are worried. I know our professors and our teachers are worried about, how do I make this transition? How do I make this go? That notion that we are in a state of change. Everybody's being asked to do something different. I gave a speech the other day where I was just talking about the fact that everybody's stressed. It isn't just the students. It's not just the professors. It's the admins running the university. It's like the amount of stress and anxiety that people feel right now is universal. It's parents, it's the community, it's business leaders, it's everybody. And I think when we're thinking about our approach to educating kids, it still has to come down to making sure that our students, young adults, they need to feel safe in this environment. They need to feel engaged. They need to feel supported, and that, like in any educational setting, I don't believe this will ever change, but the most important piece in the learning process is the relationship that we build between the instructor and the student, and that needs to be maintained. And I think that takes a little tiny bit of extra effort in an online environment.
Totally. Dean, let's fast forward for a minute. Let's fast forward 5 years. What do you think teaching and learning on a typical college campus or technical college will look like 5 years from now?
I think for me as a educational leader, I think in 5 years, I think opportunities are endless. I don't think we talk about time-bound limits. I don't think we talk about space-bound limits. I mean, there are some things that are going to require face-to-face. You can't put CDL truck driving online very easily and have it be quality. Having said that, there are bits and pieces of that same program you could put online. Some of the safety components, some of the more basic skills. I see colleges and universities really being able to expand offerings, to be able to offer more and offer them at multiple times. You know, in technical education, people oftentimes come to us on a Tuesday willing to change their life, ready to change their life. We're an open entry, open exit for some of our programs. That provides an interesting dynamic to a college campus to where you could literally come in, enroll, register all on the same day. I see universities, I see technical colleges having to be more adaptive and responsive to student needs, and really to be more global and be more accessible. I don't think it's a matter of if, I think it's a matter of when. And that excites me. We're empowering the learner. We're empowering educators to be able to have different opportunities and have different ways to engage. You know, with tools like Canvas, Mastery Connect, et cetera, whether it's an ecosystem where things are living like Canvas or an assessment management platform like Mastery Connect, data in real life, in real time, can have a real impact. And that's what excites me about the future.
T,
any thoughts from you on that question about 5 years in the future?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I'm definitely more of a traditional, like it's my entire life. As an educator, I've been very engaged with technology and all of the things that it does. But I'm also way more traditional in that there's a part of me that mourns a little bit like that. Every time I drive by the university I live right next to, and it's empty, there's a part of me that thinks, oh, you know, I miss that. I think it's going to be a combination. Anybody that thinks we're all just waiting until we can go back to normal, I don't think that's going to happen. I think this is open doors for us to think about ways that we can expand those educational opportunities in ways that we didn't before, right? Like I think it's going to create new opportunities for us to rethink the way that we make our universities more accessible to more students. It possibly in 5 years from now, I remember when the MOOC thing started, and I thought to myself, by the time my kids get in college, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't take classes from multiple universities to earn their degree. And it didn't happen in that way. But I could see that us getting more to a place where universities are more collaborative and that we are opening up programs and we are creating opportunities for students to engage in learning in ways that they haven't in a remote type of environment like this. But I also see us, you know, having that traditional on-campus experience as being a part of that. But I think we're going to shift. This has, the technology is better. We're more advanced. And I don't think we're going to go back to the way it was. I think we're going to continue to evolve and see a new normal.
Totally agree. Interesting perspective. We just posed the question to the group about what do you think education will look like in 5 years? Sylvia here on LinkedIn is saying, I see more use of VR for simulations, which is really interesting. I mean, Dean, you talked about CDLs. And yes, it's a good point. There's a lot of things that are just going to be really tough. But 5-10 years, that whole space could look very different. When you look at the evolution of electric cars and what can happen virtually today, it's going to be a fun ride. Talk to me, T. going off of the comments that you made about feeling a little bit mournful when you drive out of school and you don't see all the kind of physical stuff happening. Are we seeing a complete shift to more of a digital pedagogy?
I don't know if the word complete shift is the right way to look at it. I think that we are going to be drawn back into people will seek to have that more traditional environment. But I don't think there's any getting around that one of the biggest obstacles to people attending college right now is just the cost. It's expensive, and getting access. We started off by talking about the importance of equity. I could see where the technology is today and our experiences, our forced experiences around a remote learning environment really do create opportunities for us to be able to rethink higher education, to rethink the way that we allow students to access that education. I think our pedagogy and our ability to utilize these tools to provide better learning experiences in this type of an environment are only going to get better. And so when we think about that evolution, I don't know that it will be complete, but it will be that. It will be a continued evolution.
Interesting. Fun perspective here from Teresa on Facebook that, Dean, I want you to talk about. It seems these circumstances have forced us to become student-centered. These changes shift us away from a model that is set up to make it easy to teach, not necessarily easy to student, if you will.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Man, talk about hitting the home run, Teresa. A smart guy once told me, hard work ain't easy. And it's not easy if you are a teacher. It is not easy if you are a student. But again, I'll go back to the fact that the way that we present these opportunities to students, if we come into it with the mindset that, hey, side by side, we're into this together and we're learning, you're learning, and at the end of this, we're all going to be better because of it. No one can determine the future, and there is no future in the past. So what are we doing today in order to make that student that may be struggling's day just a little bit easier? Are we reaching out? Are we cognizant about the ability to connect virtually, whether that be a text, an email, or picking up a phone and just having a different form of communication? I think it's important for us to remember that a feedback loop by in which a teacher or an instructor is consistently providing feedback in a relevant manner to a student, both on their academic performance and as well as an interpersonal relationship, is critically important. I really do believe that connection is the best prevention for any disease or for any sort of disconnect in the workplace or between students and teachers. How do we foster positive relationships between students and faculty in a virtual setting? How do we make sure that that's safe? How do we make sure that students understand we're building a high trust, low fear environment by in which we're both going to succeed, we're both going to fail, but we're both going to get through this together? For me, that is a critical component for any of us, is to take everything we're doing with a grain of salt and think, how does this impact me as the instructor and my student as the learner? If I can't walk through as a student by the instructions I've given, I may want to rethink what I'm doing. And that's, I think, critical, is rethinking your best laid plans. I throw away your bad draft, start again. I mean, that's the cycle that we're in right now, is the constant evaluation of, is this meeting the mark or not? And I personally think that that's healthy. I've never had more rich conversations with instructors about, is this meeting students' needs? I've never had more fluid conversations about how can we make the enrollment process easier for students, given some of the constraints that we have. I don't necessarily think problem on this. I think opportunity. T, what are your thoughts?
One, I agree with almost everything you said, right? And I know that I could not articulate it any better than you did. I always like to think of this, and just as a reminder, that I believe that teaching is a series of complex human events. And I think one of the key words in there is human events. And so long as, and this is the point you were making, so long as our focus continues to be on how do we build those relationships, how do we maintain those human connections with our students, whether that's, in a virtual environment or in the classroom. We don't do that well enough, even in a face-to-face environment, make sure that our students feel connected, and that there is that relationship that is built so that we can pass that information and knowledge. That is, so long as we get that right, I think the sky's the limit in terms of how we can continue to evolve our practices to better meet the needs of our students in whatever environment we're asked to do it.
So T, I love that statement. I was actually furiously writing it down because that's like fantastic tweet copy that's going to be going out with this session, that teaching is a series of complex events. I want you to dig into that a little bit. Talk everybody that's on here with us through what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, and remember, it's complex human events, right? Teaching is a series of complex human events. And anyone who's ever taught in the classroom knows, like you're dealing with 30, 40 human beings in your classroom. And you can, on a day in and day out basis, you can walk in and not really understand what those students are bringing into your classroom with them, right? That all of the events that occur in their lives, when they walk into your classroom, they bring them with them. And a lot of those events can be very distracting or debilitating to the learning process. The better we know our students, the better able we are to kind of identify when students walk into our classroom and there are issues. It's amazing how anyone who starts a semester with a group of students, they're just strangers to you. But by the time you're done with a semester, they're not. They are friends. They are people. They are people that you care about and that you're invested in. And that, when I say it's a series of complex human events, that's what happens when we build relationships with our students in the classroom, is we get to know them over time. And as we get to know them over time, we are better able to meet their needs. And so long as we can do that in a virtual environment, keep in mind that, yes, we're teaching content and telling students to do things and turn things in and earn a grade, and that we don't dismiss this idea that if we want students to learn and engage, there is that need for us to continue to connect and build on those human events, so that we are not just teaching and learning, but we're building up people's capacity within the subject area of concern for us, but more so just as human beings.
Brilliant. So let's dig in for just a minute into the whole equity issue, which that's been a big point of discussion. I think, T, you did a really good session. I don't remember if it was with DeAndre, potentially, where we talked about equity. And this is a big deal. When you think that for a lot of people, they've been out of the classroom now for 6+ months. Some of them have gone back. Some of them have been sent back out. Some of them are still fighting through. But when you look at socioeconomic factors that drive any kind of student success, obviously technology is a big time enabler of that. Access to the internet, access to learning resources, technology devices, psychological well-being. Anything here that is overly surprising to you?
I'm going to jump in on the psychological well-being. I'm not surprised at it. I just want to highlight it because here's the reality. You said it earlier. Kids have been without school for 6 months in a lot of cases. Our college-age students have been in some sort of a remote setting or no setting at all. When I look at the psychological well-being in my conversations with K-12 educators, that's the number one concern amongst most of the K-12 environment. Is we're having students that are coming back that for the first time in 6 months have access to a second adult that may or may not be able to get them the help that they need in terms of mental health resources, food resources, the very basic needs that schools have come to provide for students. I think we're starting to acknowledge the fact that schools had morphed into things well beyond learning, whether that be at the K-12 or the higher ed level. So for me, as I look at this, we're remiss if we don't acknowledge the fact that unless we have a high trust, low fear environment and our basic needs are met, we're basically stuck. So what can we do to get past the point of access, devices, and that safety? What are things that we need to do digitally to do that? I don't have all the answers, but I know that we need to have those conversations. Discussions of equity, discussions of access need to start taking place if they haven't. And for many, it's the first time we've had to hold these conversations. It's okay if they're messy. It's okay if you don't know what urbanicity means. It's okay if you don't know what rurality means. As long as you know that there is a face waiting for you to help on the backside of that, you know what you need to do as an educator. You need to find a way. And I hate to say that just find a way, but there is no roadmap. So we've got to acknowledge these things exist. Once we come to an understanding that these are realities for students, we can move to problem solving. But we got to notice, we've got to wonder, then we need to take action.
So T, over to you as well. How do we solve this engagement problem that exists between students from two different sides of the economic divide?
Yeah, I think that becomes a challenge, right? Like I think I've spent my entire career wanting to solve that problem, right? Whether it's not just a technology challenge. It's more than that. It is an access challenge. When we talk about the differences between our students who live in at-risk communities and come to us with the baggage that is associated with that. I think the psychological well-being, as Dean was talking about, becomes critically important. But you asked Dean, does any of this surprise you when you look at this? And the answer is no. I don't think any of this surprises me. I would be interesting to see more of a breakdown in terms of how this report covers different geographic areas. It would be interesting to get kind of a breakdown of how this impacts in those other countries, in those looking at more socioeconomic breakdowns. Overall, it doesn't surprise me, but we're talking about higher ed. We shouldn't, if we're not surprised, we should also be concerned that, every one of our students in 2020 attending college should have access to the internet and a device, 100%, and so while it's not surprising, when you talk about how do we bridge that gap, we bridge that gap when we create equitable experiences for all of our students, starting pre-K, K, all the way up through high school. This isn't a higher ed problem. This is just a general education problem. Every single student deserves to have access to high quality learning environments where they have access to the things that they need in preparation to going to college. And then once we have our students in college, every student should have access. And we're not there yet. These numbers look pretty good. I think most of us would probably celebrate the fact that we're almost at 90% of our students with access. And on the access to a technology device, one thing I think that's really helpful when we think about Canvas, a lot of students, I'm guessing that device is a phone. And so, the app that students can download on their phone, it's really weird because I've said this a lot. My daughter does almost all of her interaction and work with Canvas on her phone. And so she does have a nice laptop that she could access, and I think she probably does from time to time, but I'm surprised at how much of her interaction is done on her phone. And so that's also, when we think about access to technology and devices, I think it's really important from a development perspective that we are building the kinds of tools that students access on the devices that they use most often, like their phone.
Interesting. So let's talk about action. What are some things that educators or administrators, schools could or should be doing, especially when they likely aren't aware of the financial circumstances of specific students? Where should they start? What should they do, Dean?
I take a look at that and I say, has everybody completed a FAFSA? And I know that is so simple, but for a lot of students, complete your FAFSA. There's a lot of financial aid opportunities out there that you might not be aware of. The second thing is, as an admissions process or within financial aid, are we constantly going through and evaluating whether or not our students are able to maintain their current rate of matriculation, or are they, below progress? One of the things that we've instituted this last year is really frequent checks on student progress through their program. What that means for us is we're pulling data on a weekly basis to take a look at who's matriculating, who's not, and that's based on their performance on competencies. But if they're not progressing, then we start to take a look at, Have they accessed we use Canvas a lot. Have they accessed Canvas? If yes, why? If no, why? We want to know if they're not progressing but accessing Canvas. Are they accessing and utilizing it appropriately? Or if they're not accessing Canvas, is there maybe one of these needs that an internet or a device could help rectify? One of the things that we've done is we've engaged some of our donors in order to provide actual devices instead of scholarships to students. What we found is a lot of our clientele simply need that Chromebook, that access to an internet, a hotspot, whatever it is, in order to matriculate through that program. So we're starting to be more creative with the ways that we're utilizing financial aid, and really the way that we're engaging our donors is different. We're starting to talk about holistically, what do our students need to be successful, as opposed to just tuition and fees. There is that at-home component or that virtual component that we need to start taking into account if we want to keep our students in class. So those are some of the things I would say is have frequent checks for student progress, and then identify what is root causal to them either matriculating or not. More likely than not, it may be a basic need. If not, it's an engagement need. You deal with skill and will completely differently, but at least you'll know what next steps to take in order to meet the needs of the student.
Mark, you're on mute, but can you put Lorraine Hawkins' comment on there? Bring that up. You know, when you asked Dean that question, you know, obviously Dean and I are touchy-feely guys. We always end up kind of thinking student first and thinking about how to support the instructors and the educators. And, you know, how do we bridge that gap? I think it's in acknowledging that there are parts of our country where we still have work to do. You know, we all are part of the same community in our, you know, when we are listening to our legislators talk about, you know, where are we investing our dollars in supporting our communities? It's not just my community, it's the broader community that we all live in. And we have parts of our country where not every student is going to have access. It's not their fault. It's an infrastructure issue. And I think we have to advocate for equity of infrastructure and support, whether, you know, whether we're impacted by that or not, as members of a society that values having well-educated students. We've got to be mindful that's not just our neighborhood, that is the broader spectrum of need across our states. If we have areas that still don't have access to that, we should be advocating for that equity to exist within our schools, universities, for our students in those environments. That's how we create opportunity for all of our students, is when we make sure that the least among us are given access. We all benefit from that. And sometimes I think we get caught up in, I know when my students were applying to universities, I wanted my kids to be at the top. You know, I worked really hard to get my kids into a position. I didn't do it, they did it themselves, but they went to good high schools and they achieved well, and they had the kinds of supports at home that would ensure that they were going to college and they were getting the scholarships, and that was a real benefit for them. But I think that we shouldn't be stepping on others to elevate ourselves, that we are better off when we are advocating for all students to have access. So when we look at that 89, 88, 87, 88, those are things we should look at and say, we've got work to do.
Interesting.
Well, I want to just step in and say, you know what, that 11%, how would you react if your own child was in that 11% that didn't have the access, that didn't have that opportunity? I'm going to brag on one of our local providers. A lot of our students in our K-12 and our colleges in eastern Utah, I mean, we're very, very rural. I would say that the county I live in has more cattle than people, and that's a fact. What was really cool is the old adage of it takes a village. Without pay, without an expectation of payback, our local internet provider made a pledge to ensure that any of our students in our service region that needed access to the internet have access to the internet. And they're really starting to take a look at this and say, if we want to be viable as a rural community, we have to do things in order to support learning across K-16. And I really think as collegiate administrators, as ed leaders, we need to be creative in the types of partnerships that we're out there developing. We need to ensure that we're not just relying on our state or federal funds in order to provide a quality opportunity for our students. It may force us to engage differently with different leaders, but what a great opportunity. I think that some of our local providers have done things that are altruistic and are some of the best things that can be done within their power to really help schools and students move forward. So don't be afraid to knock on a door and ask for help. Vulnerability is valuable, and it's something that we need to practice a little more often, especially in higher ed.
That's awesome. T, so I want to have you wrap us up, but as we do, we've been talking today about our state of student success in higher ed report, where we had a survey with over 7,000 administrators, students, educators. It goes deep into the impact of COVID-19, which we really haven't talked deeply on. Go check it out. We put the link in the comments. I'll drop it again right now. I think you'll find some things that are really interesting in there. T, as we close this out, any final thoughts from you on just telling our viewers what it is that you took from the report? Yeah, so in looking at it, that there's a lot to celebrate. I think we are very fortunate to be in this time with the access to the technology that we have to make that transition as quickly as it had to be made. I think if we were just 5 years ago or 10 years ago, our ability to go from a traditional face-to-face learning environment to a remote learning environment and be able to maintain a pretty darn good, based on the report, a pretty good outcome in terms of being able to maintain those programs and educational opportunities for students. It wasn't perfect, there's obviously things that everybody's going to learn, and that's only going to make us stronger. It's going to make us better. It's almost forced in a lot of ways, the innovation, and it's forced us to think outside of the box, and nobody wanted to do it. It wasn't like people were jumping up and down excited about a pandemic driving us all into our homes and causing us to have to rethink the way we educate students. But I would say the thing that's amazing to me is how hard our educators have worked, how hard our students and how adaptive our students have been to be able to make this transition. And I think the thing that I look at is I'm hopeful. I see a lot of positive things that are coming out of this experience. Certainly, we could belabor, the negative for hours to come, but there are a lot of positive things. Dean talked about the resilience and the adaptability of our teachers and the willingness to kind of step up, almost to a fault. I have friends that are educators that are working with students that are driving themselves right to the max in terms of what they're capable of, but they do it because we care about our kids. We care about creating good educational opportunities. It's exposed areas where we can do better, but ultimately, I think that I can say this as an employee of Instructure. I'm really proud of the fact that we have worked as hard as we have to be able to make sure that they have the tools and the resources that they need to be able to continue these relationships, to continue schooling. But more than anything else, I'm humbled and blown away by the commitment that we've seen from educators all around the world, as they have worked so hard to make sure that our students are continuing to get a quality education and maintaining that kind of flexibility at great personal expense. So I think that there's a lot to celebrate in this report, as much as we've kind of talked about some of the holes, and let's don't be complacent. And if I was really saying what should we be celebrating, we should be celebrating our educators who make that happen. Hear, hear. Hear, hear. As always, T and Dean, it's a pleasure to be on with you. Everybody, we're back again tomorrow morning at 10:30 a.m. Download the report. You'll find a lot of stuff in there that's really interesting, whether you're a higher ed or a K-12 educator, that hopefully will give you some ideas for the great work that you're already doing and how we can do even better. Thanks, everybody. We will see you tomorrow. Have a good one.
See y'all.